I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico, and I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
This week we're talking to Darrel Wanzer-Serrano about a really cool book he wrote called The New York Young Lords and the Struggle for Liberation. That book was published in 2015 by Temple University Press. It's a really neat book that's not just about the New York Young Lords, but it's also about rhetoric and decolonial theory, all of the kinds of things that we on this podcast love. There's a really specific bit in there about this thing called the church offensive that we're going to focus on, particularly where the Young Lords basically seize a church. So I don't know how I could get you any more excited than just saying those things. You can also check out this other book that he wrote called The Young Lords, A Reader, from New York University Press. It's another sort of collection of essays about the Young Lords in particular. The Young Lords, I didn't really know very much about until we started kind of getting into the research for this episode, but they are a really interesting movement with, I think, a lot of good ideas and something kind of we can grapple with and use to think through the history of the left in the United States, decolonial struggle, and also Christianity. So this is a conversation that you will want to be at your full attention for. All right, let's shoot it over to Darrel.
So this week on the show, we're talking with Darrel Wanzer-Serrano, the author of the book The New York Young Lords and the Struggle for Liberation. It's a really, really great book. Matt and I have been talking a lot about it. There's a lot going on in it, all kinds of different discourses that get involved, but in a way that doesn't feel like too cumbersome, I think. So it's very readable and really exciting and fun to read and an inspiring text. So we'll get into that in a minute. But before we do, Darrel, what have you been up to lately this summer? Anything you're particularly excited about?
The thing that I've been working on the most this summer has been some kind of disciplinary-oriented projects related to the kind of status of race in rhetorical studies. There was a really cool article that came out in the Journal of Communication a month or two, or I guess a couple of months ago now, called #CommunicationSoWhite. And it did a kind of neat both quantitative and critical analysis of the stuff that's been published in the major communication studies journals over the last, I think since 1990. And one of the things that it showed is that rhetorical studies, my kind of subdisciplinary home, is kind of the worst. And so there's some various projects that I've been working on, getting involved in to help address that in the kind of disciplinary scholarship in my field.
Wow, that's really cool.
That sounds really important.
It's fun. I mean, it's a really important topic. It's a really, it's incredibly problematic that since 1990, I think something like only a dozen articles by scholars of color have been published in our flagship journal. So being able to address that and think kind of critically about what the future can hold and what kinds of things scholars can be doing to address this problem, I think is really exciting, and I feel lucky to have the opportunity to do it, particularly in the outlets that I'll be doing it in. So,
yeah, that's great. Let us know when you get some of that going. For sure, be glad to follow that up. Matt, what have you been up to this summer?
Kind of a lot. Being an academic in the summer is so awesome because I can do everything I meant to do all school year. So I finished up a few journal articles and they're going to be published soon. We're working on that kind of stuff. I sent out a book proposal, feeling really productive, like the strangest feeling in the world, actually. But yeah, been cool. Dean, what are you doing?
Nice. Also pretty busy. I went to a Luce Rigore conference recently, and that was my big thing I was excited about. So that was really good, and saw some friends, and went to Niagara Falls, which is really great. The Canadian side of Niagara Falls is really funny because there's all, the beauty of the falls and the majesty of a bunch of water falling into a bunch of other water. It's very exciting. But nearby the falls is just the biggest sort of tourist trap that I've ever seen. It's like riddled with like Ripley's Wax Museums and like weird kind of movie theaters and like a SpongeBob 4D ride. Like it's very sort of culture industry to the max. So I always love going there because the juxtaposition is just actually really fun. And my partner Emily and I just try to like give ourselves over to it, have a good time. So it was pretty great. It was a good weekend.
Can I ask a question? What is a SpongeBob 4D ride?
I don't know. Regrettably, I would have gone on it. In fact, it was my biggest regret leaving. We don't have a car, so we have to rent a car. So it was just the window was just closing on when we could have spent the time there before we had to return it. So I'm just gonna have to go back. That's the moral of the story. Great. Well, everybody's super busy, but it sounds like a pretty good summer so far. Maybe we should jump into the book here. So whenever we talk with an author, Darrel, we always ask them to give a little bit of like an elevator pitch for the article or book that we're talking about. So what made you want to write this book about the Young Lords in New York, and what did you hope to accomplish by writing it?
The elevator pitch version of that is that I wanted to write a scholarly monograph on the Young Lords, in part because I feel like this group, which is, I think, one of the most significant, if arguably the most significant group of the kind of radical leftist group, the Puerto Rican diaspora, has been so understudied. Prior to this book, I don't think there was another kind of scholarly monograph on the Young Lords. Prior to my previous book, which was an edited collection, an anthology of primary texts on them, those materials really weren't available outside of special collections and some stuff on microfilm too. So I wanted to be able to write a kind of critical rhetorical history of the Young Lords, to be able to give people something to hold on to and something to enter into a conversation about the history and ideas of that important group. The kind of longer version of that answer is that it was, this project was an incredibly transformative experience for me that started in graduate school. I've been wanting to write, I'd been planning to write a dissertation, and I talk about this in the book, actually. I'd planning to write a dissertation on ballots as the sublime object of democracy, a kind of, Zizkian election 2000 inspired kind of project. And it wasn't until my last semester of what was supposed to be my last semester of coursework that I stumbled upon the Young Lords, and it really changed me. I mean, this was I could really identify with them as kind of first generation college student, second generation Puerto Rican, who had been kind of detached from my history in some significant ways. And so coming across the Young Lords, I realized at that point that I had to do work on them. And so it kind of threw my whole, graduate degree into a bit of a whirlwind there at the end, because I was deviating from the plan and ended up sticking around for extra coursework, and it all worked out. But it really set me off on a path that I'm glad that I took. Yeah.
That's great. The book is really amazing. It's something, I've not finished it yet, but reading through it, I think everything you said kind of shines through in just like your writing and the way you approach it. I think I really like it too, because it's not just like a straightforward history, but you really go into some of the rhetoric behind it. And even all the connections you're making constantly with decolonial theory is so strong. Well, we can get to maybe some of that and the importance of it in a bit, but for people who have never heard of the Young Lords, because like you mentioned, there's never been sort of a monograph like this before, could you set the historical stage for us a little bit? Like, when were they operating? What were they like? What was sort of the impetus behind the Young Lords?
Sure. So the Young Lords actually started as a kind of turf gang in Chicago in 1959. It was a collection of some young folks who kind of banded together to protect their neighborhood and to have some kind of strength through unity. In 1968, the leader of that gang, a guy named Jose Cha-Cha Jimenez, was in jail, in the Cook County Jail, and had a kind of conversion experience. He actually talks about it through this rhetoric of conversion. And it was, something that came from his engagement of Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, and the autobiography of Malcolm X, along with some other kind of Black radical writing. And he realized that he needed to turn the organization political. And so upon his release, he declared that they would be a street political organization. And they started working in coalition with others, especially the Black Panthers, but also a group of kind of radical white Appalachian folks named the Young Patriots, and turned their attention to kind of transforming the community. So that's how it started in Chicago. And then in New York, it's sort of a different, it's a very different story of development, where the people who were kind of leading the formation of the organization were in college. They started it as kind of a study group in some ways, where they were wanting to fill in the gaps that they were finding they weren't getting in their education. And they found this model in the Chicago Young Lords when they were reading an interview of Cha-Cha Jimenez in the Black Panthers newspaper, and so they kind of realized that that's what they wanted to do, and so they went out. They got permission from Cha-Cha to have a charter for a New York chapter. And on July 26, 1969, they formed. And so they were, from 69 to 1970 to May 1970, they were affiliated with the Chicago group as the Young Lords organization. In May 1970, they split and became the Young Lords Party. And then in 1972, they had another transformation, would be their final one, and became the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers Organization. And I can talk more about those transitions if you'd like, but they were basically a kind of, a grassroots street political organization that engaged in a lot of community service and education programs that revolved around health, politics, and in general, I think decolonizing their community, right? Establishing kind of practices of self-determination over land and institutions, and enlisting the people in that process.
That's so cool. We should maybe talk a little bit about some of those transitions. Maybe we'll do that in a minute when we start talking about the church offensive, as you call it. But to maybe fill out a little bit more of the history and kind of the beginning, and then this might kind of bleed into that conversation. But like the Black Panthers, the Young Lords ended up with a program and a platform. So we were kind of reading through that this week, and it's a pretty amazing series of positions. But one thing they do is intentionally connect their struggle to other national liberation struggles, as you just mentioned, to the struggle of poor whites, organized poor whites, and also to communism and these kind of really radical political movements. What were their political associations like? Like, how did those coalitions form, and what did they look like in New York or elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, so it's complicated and not. The complicated part is that one of the things that kind of that drew me to the Young Lords, and that still kind of makes me amazed at them in their strongest period of activism, was that they were so kind of ecumenical in their ideology, right? They weren't hardliners in any one kind of position of orthodoxy. And that allowed them, really encouraged them to be pretty flexible in who they would work with and what they would do. And so, as I'm sure we'll talk about when we talk about the church offensive, they didn't just go in and take over from the very beginning. They tried to work through the kind of structures of the church in order to be able to do the kinds of things that they wanted to do. And so they were always open to be working with people. Now, specifically, they worked very closely, and this got started in Chicago, with groups like the Panthers and the Young Patriots. And in fact, in Chicago, they called that the Rainbow Coalition. This is pre-Jesse Jackson. This was the original Rainbow Coalition. It was a kind of organize your own approach, where they were organizing within the kind of Latino communities, but they wanted to work in coalition with folks who were really in the same struggle in a lot of ways, right? And in New York, that meant that they had a really strong partnership with the Black Panthers. Some of the members of the Young Lords and friends of the Young Lords had, prior to the Young Lords' existence, had really tried finding a home in the Black Panthers, and ultimately that for a lot of them that didn't work out, and kind of created the impetus in some ways for them to form and join the Young Lords. But they were always kind of working with their, really just crosstown compatriots. They got ideas from them in part, right? So like the breakfast programs were things that the Panthers really spearheaded around the country. They learned lessons from them. The Panthers were, they were more experienced in this, and they had each other's backs. So there were some pretty tight connections that were formed between the groups and with other groups in the community too. I think with the important focus always that the recognition that some organizations had a better grasp and or were better equipped to deal with particular situations and particular problems and particular issues than others.
Within their platform that we were just mentioning there a little bit, there's some like really interesting points kind of along the way. Like Dean mentioned a minute ago, they were working sort of towards communism and towards different ideas of liberation. One of the really interesting parts of their platform to me was about the internal organization of the Young Lords and how they were specifically targeting oppressive machismo, and they said instead of like machismo sort of for the sake of masculinity, but instead for the sake of revolution. They also insisted on the liberation of women as well. So how did they carry this type of feeling out in their movement specifically? Like, what did this look like when they actually got to it?
Yeah, it really changed form, right? So there's two versions of the platform. There's the kind of first one from October 1969, and then there's the second one, which I think is first published in November 1970. And there are definitely some strong similarities. There's some just straight up reproduction of points between the two 13-point programs and program and platform documents. But on the issue of kind of women and machismo in the organization, that's where there's some of the most radical shift. So if you'll permit me, in the original program and platform, point number 10 began, "We want equality for women. Machismo must be revolutionary, not oppressive." And then in the revised platform, point number 5, "We want equality for women. Down with machismo and male chauvinism." And so I think what that reflects is a few things. I mean, it reflects a really significant struggle that took place within the organization for women's voices to be heard. When the organization first formed, it was essentially an all-male leadership. And that was reflected in things like this idea that machismo could somehow be revolutionary and not oppressive. As one of the women of the Young Lords, replied to that, how can that be, right? Is there such a thing as revolutionary racism? No, there isn't. So we have to kind of put that in check a little bit and rethink the way that we're approaching issues of gender and equality. And so, there was, I'm not sure how much detail you want me to get into here, but I do talk about this a lot in the book. I mean, there was a prolonged period of kind of education and struggle within the organization that led to the formation of the Women's Union, and also led to a moment where after the Central Committee, who again at the time was all men, kind of disappeared for a period of time, the membership, the kind of the cadre of the organization, voted voted a few changes in, right? One is that they essentially kind of temporarily demoted everyone from the Central Committee until they could engage in enough kind of self-criticism to be able to take on the responsibility of their roles again. The other thing was that they insisted that women be part of the leadership of the organization, and that there be a kind of gender parity in all of the organizing and activities of the organization, right? So if men and women would go out together to sell the newspaper, to speak at events and things like that. And that led to some really kind of profound and complex views about the intersections of race and racism and sexism and capitalism and colonialism that are spelled out really nicely in their position paper on women, but are also, I think, developed well in the book that they published in 1971 called Palante, the Young Lords Party.
There's so much that you do in your book to kind of draw out the different rhetorical developments that happen within the party. I think that's actually one of the most valuable things I found in the text, because it's one thing to read histories of revolutionary movements, and they can be very inspiring and interesting. But one thing that you kind of go out of your way to point out in a way that's really valuable is that there's a real evolution of thinking, and there's a kind of thinking that emerges out of all these experiments. And out of the work of actually trying to imagine what this movement might look like, that willingness to change, and you called it earlier being flexible, just seems like a really important kind of lesson, I guess, from the Young Lords.
Yeah, and it was. I think it was, and I think the its opposite, right, is also an important lesson, because when they became the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers Organization in 1972. They basically stopped that flexibility, and they stopped what I think was one of their greatest strengths, was that they listened to the people of the community. That started going away a bit, right? They started taking this position of, they basically quit doing their various serve the people programs in the community and went to work in factories trying to unionize people. And that in doing so, they were no longer engaging in those kinds of what I call that decolonial ethic of love that involves listening to the voices of people in the community that were the strength of their initial activism. I mean, that's why they did the garbage offensive when they let everything off. That's really how they developed their position in the church offensive, and really all those early programming and service programs were coming from the people in the community and the needs of the people in the community, right? And putting that into conversation with all of this really radical theory that they'd been reading, like Franz Fanon and Karl Marx and others. So.
Well, we can get to the church offensive in a minute, and I'm really excited to, because it's pretty much the coolest thing. But it might be important to introduce the garbage offensive first as a background for that, since it's kind of the precursor. You talk about the garbage offensive as a good example of what you call delinking from coloniality, which has some bigger ramifications in the church offensive too. So what did the garbage offensive look like? How does it play into the dynamics of coloniality and decoloniality that you trace throughout the book?
Sure. So the garbage offensive was their kind of like inaugural, point of activism. While they were going through the kind of process of opening this charter in New York, they started they were trying to figure out like what they should be doing, and kind of knew that like going around and just kind of lecturing people about, Fanon or Marx wasn't really going to be the ticket, right? And so the very first thing that they did was they went around and just kind of asked people like, hey, what's going on? What needs to be fixed? Like, what do you think the biggest problem is? And that very act of going and talking and listening and internalizing that, I think is itself a kind of decolonial practice, right? Especially in a community like East Harlem or El Barrio at that time, people weren't asked that, right? They were told what to do. It was assumed that they wouldn't be interested in a question like that. And so they figured out the problem was garbage, right? I mean, it was filling the streets, it was filling empty lots. People, kids would cut themselves on rusty metal, and the city wasn't picking up the trash in the same way that it did in white neighborhoods. And so they simply went around and started picking up garbage and putting it in bags and putting it in trash cans. And they did that, for several weeks. And, the city kind of kept leaving it there. They still weren't picking it up regularly enough. It would get, thrown back out into the street. And so they went to the Department of Sanitation and asked for some more supplies one day. Were told no. And so they took them. And that act of defiance kind of inspired people in the community who initially were like, what are these kids doing? They're just cleaning up trash. Like, why would they be doing that? And that led to kind of escalation in this, and really, why I think some of the members started calling it the garbage offensive. It started with people taking the trash and putting it in the street to block traffic, knowing that if cars and buses couldn't make it down into this into the city, that people weren't, businesses weren't making money, and that would hopefully solve the problem. And it didn't, because a bus could just push it out of the way. And so some enterprising members of the community decided to start lighting it on fire. And they did that across multiple intersections, covering several blocks, major thoroughfares, and that got the city's attention a little bit. Now the kind of success of it was short-lived, and I mean, it's still like, if you've ever been to New York City and you've ever walked around, between like East Harlem versus Midtown, right? That the city takes their responsibility differently in each of those neighborhoods, in no small part, I think, because of the makeup of the neighborhoods. But the kind of real success of it was that they really marked off their community as something new, right? They established that this wasn't a community of a bunch of docile Puerto Ricans who were going to just kind of take it from the city. They marked it off as a colonized zone, and that practice of naming it, right, of kind of establishing what this community was, had power. And I talk about it in the book as it's a kind of act of epistemic disobedience, right? Breaking from the way that they'd been taught to think about their community and their relationship to land, and remarking that space as something different, right? As a space that was radical, and the people in that space could occupy kind of positions that were radical as well. And so that really, it galvanized a lot of support from the community. It got them known, and it really started that process of transforming the community and the people in it. After the garbage offensive was done, they decided to kind of like take a step back and not do any more direct action on that kind of scale, and instead turn attention to what they thought were the other big problems in the community, which were health related, principally dealing with tuberculosis, which was a big problem, often undiagnosed, and lead poisoning, which was a huge problem in these, tenements run by slumlords.
Huh. That idea that like lighting a bunch of garbage on fire is sort of a rhetorical move, I think is so fascinating and important. Just a really interesting way of looking at actions, where actions have something to say. You know, they're not just like irrational outbursts or something like that, but like something's being created in that instance, I think is really inspiring. And maybe that's a good segue into talking about the People's Church, because there's all kinds of really great things you draw out similarly there. So to get into it, we'll play a little bit of audio from a film that you sent to us. Forgive my Spanish pronunciation, but El Pueblo se levanta. And so here's Juan Gonzalez talking from inside First Spanish Methodist Church in New York.
The main thing that we're clear on is that it's such a simple thing to give us space. And now that we've gotten into this church and eaten here and been here for hours, we know what a big place it is. It's incredible, the space in this church. All unused, never open to the community. And it's just incredible to us how such a simple thing like granting a space has resulted in so many heads being busted and so much trouble in East Harlem. And our only understanding of that has to be that religion, organized religion has so enslaved our people, has so destroyed their minds to thinking about salvation in the hereafter, they refuse to deal with the conditions that they have now and with the oppression that they have now. The people who come to this church are mostly Puerto Ricans who have already raised themselves to a certain standard. Many of them have left the community. They no longer relate to the community except to drive in on Sundays and go to services. And it's amazing to us how people can talk about, Jesus, who walked among the poor, the poorest, the most oppressed, the prostitutes, the drug addicts of his time, that these people can claim to be Christians, right? And they've forgotten that it was Jesus who said that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And they forget that it was Jesus who said the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And they forget that it was Jesus who said feed the hungry and clothe the poor. And this is what we're after. We're after following the tenets and the spirit of Christianity, not the letter of Christianity, of those Bibles that have perverted Jesus' real revolutionary and social consciousness.
So there's so much going on in this clip that we should get into, but maybe we could start with the occupation itself and get an idea of what exactly is going on and what the context of that clip is. So Gonzalez talks about some violence that resulted around the church, and you mentioned a confrontation with police early on. Can you kind of recall that scene? Like what kind of builds up into this moment? What's in the background, and then what is kind of happening that would prompt a police encounter when it sort of all comes to a head?
Yeah, so let me get up to that point of the confrontation. After the garbage offensive I was just mentioning, they kind of took that break from direct action to focus on these health programs and also just general organizing. And part of what they were developing was this commitment to self-determination of land and of institutions, which was an important point in their program. And so, starting, in, I believe it's late October 1969, they're kind of going around to various churches within the community. I mean, churches are important. Churches are important to Latino communities, to all communities, really. And so they start going around and seeing like, okay, what are these institutions that are so kind of central to the lives of people in the community actually doing for the community? And it turns out quite a bit, right? Most churches, don't just do their Sunday services. They're doing after-school programs and other kinds of service programs to help their parishioners and to help the local community. Well, one of the churches, the First Spanish Methodist Church, which sits at a very kind of like central location in El Barrio, wasn't really doing a whole lot. They, according to the Young Lords accounts, they'd open up for church services on Sunday, and that was it, right? They weren't open any other days. And so they approached the church about doing a few programs out of their facilities. So they wanted to do this breakfast program. They wanted to do some political education programming and some health programming. Those discussions didn't go so well for a few reasons. First, the church congregation was evangelical and conservative, right? So in espousing the kind of leftist beliefs that they did, the young lords were, fairly resistant to organized religion, as we just heard. Even if many of the members have had religious backgrounds, those attitudes weren't kind of particularly welcomed by the leadership and membership of the church. And so the kind of ideological tension between what the young lords advocated politically, right, decolonial liberation, socialist redistribution, the kind of gap between that and what the church espoused politically and spiritually appeared to be really insurmountable. Okay. The second problem was that the pastor was an anti-Castro Cuban exile. So, the young lords were, pro-Castro and more prominently pro-Che. And so, the images and words of Che, they had, in a lot of their programming. And so that wasn't a very good matchup. And the third problem was that the vast majority of the leadership and the membership of the church, in the Young Lords assessment, didn't really reside in the community. And so they didn't see a pressing need to expend church resources, even if that's just space, to support the programs in that neighborhood. And so a spokesperson for the church explained their resistance like this, and I'm quoting here: "The First Spanish Church is a conservative church, as are most of our evangelical Spanish churches. The tactics of the Young Lords and their ideology have been offensive to the people of the local congregation," end quote. And so, it was a pretty, there were some significant constraints that the Young Lords faced in making these requests of the church, but they decided to kind of keep going and attend services and be a presence in that space. So, as I mentioned, that started in late October 1969. On December 7th is when we have that clash with the police. And so what happened was they had been sitting in on service again. And when a period of kind of free testimony opened up, Felipe Luciano stood up and spoke. As he started speaking, the police moved in. They'd been kind of waiting, and there was a bit of a brawl. Several people were injured. The biggest injuries were on Felipe Luciano, who broke his arm, and 14 people were arrested. But that didn't stop what the Young Lords were trying to do. They kept, they immediately held a rally outside and kept showing up week after week. So a couple weeks after that, on December 21st, they had a meeting with the lay board after services, and 150 members of the Young Lords attended that service. The meeting with the lay board didn't go well, and so on the next Sunday, on December 28th, after the parishioners left and Juan Gonzalez tried to speak, they basically took the church. They boarded it up, they locked everyone else out, and they declared it liberated territory.
So the church offensive is so interesting to me. I mean, the whole thing is absolutely wild that this went down. But I guess to me, the most sort of provoking and kind of funny thing about the whole event or series event is that you note that there are these parishioners who are really conservative and the church is conservative, which is definitely not hard for us to imagine. And all these Young Lord supporters who end up attending these services and kind of being with these people. And eventually the Young Lords, they give up trying to negotiate and they take the space for themselves. But before that, there is this kind of patient negotiation where it seems like Luciano's words kind of become part of the liturgy itself, or at least part of the church service. So how did the church leadership and the members react to those appeals, the kind of consistent appeals after the sermon was over?
Yeah, I mean, mostly by ignoring them. One of the things that the Young Lords would recount in their retellings of the tale is that people would just leave. And for the most part, people just weren't willing to listen. They were just okay, we're out of here. Service is done. We're gone. Some were willing to listen. But ultimately, there were some pretty significant sticking points, right? Mostly around things other than the breakfast program, and those are sticking points that I think are rooted in those ideological differences that they had. They didn't want the church didn't want these young socialist radicals to come in and be using their space to poison other people's minds. But I think it is fascinating and important that they were so patient, that the young lords were so patient and persistent, and trying to kind of like work with the church, trying to basically get them to hear them, right? This kind of goes back to that point that I led off with, talking about the garbage offensive. Listening, right, and the kind of like self-criticism that truly listening entails is something that they were trying to model and get other people to practice as well. Ultimately, unsuccessfully in this particular instance, right? In the sense that, the church wasn't really willing to listen to them.
Yeah, I was just thinking too a little bit about the scene here, because you have some figures in the book, and I think there's around like 80 parishioners who regularly go to the church, and then there's 150 young lords who show up a few times, so like nearly double the typical church service. And it's so funny, right? Because every pastor longs for the day where their congregation like is almost triple the size that it was before. And naturally, that's not the case here. It's really funny to imagine. For a little while, I went to a conservative evangelical church when I was an adolescent, and imagining like a group of socialists showing up and like participating and like waiting their turn and then standing up and talking and then having the cops like bust them up. Like, that is a scene that I can't even sort of think about. There's something somewhat comical about it, that they are so patient and polite about it. And I think it's cool that, as you were talking earlier about some of the other kind of strategies they've had, you get this real sense that they're trying to find a way in that actually kind of makes sense. They're not just coming in and like imposing like their platform or program or whatever, even though they're committed to it, or like their ideals, but they're trying to connect with language that seems to track. And I think that comes out really well in that Gonzalez quote we heard. So maybe we can talk a little more about that. So the way that he explains the occupation is interesting, because he says the young lords are invoking like the spirit of Christianity against the like what we might call the dead letter being followed in the church. So do you think there was a kind of like liberation theology at work among the young lords, like trying to really appropriate Christian imagery, and not even in a cynical way, but in a way that sort of makes sense, like that would appeal to actual Christians? How do you think that language may have connected with people that they wanted to empower, or like hopefully that they wanted to empower?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a long tradition with that, with doing just that within Puerto Rican communities, right? When we look at the ways in which Puerto Ricans, particularly on the island, made sense and created compatibilities between kind of old practices of African religiosity and spiritualism in combination with Catholicism, right? And so I think that there is this kind of long tradition of trying to create those compatibilities and trying to make sense out of things, given the kind of constraints and affordances of the terms that are available for them. Now, whether that was explicitly or intentionally a kind of liberation theology, I'm not 100% sure. I think that it was more, my sense is that it's more a kind of latching onto these elements of Christianity and of kind of Jesus's teachings that kind of struck a tone with them, right, in terms of that kind of social justice message, and knowing that they couldn't just come in and say, hey, religion is the opiate of the masses, get over yourselves, right? That's not going to go over particularly well with people who their whole lives have been brought up in a kind of in a somewhat religious context. And so I think acknowledging that and saying, okay, well, what Jesus taught us, right, is really important. Like, we're down with all of that. It's it's the system, right, that is the problem, which is really consistent with their kind of like Marcusean systemic kind of critique.
Well, thinking more about that, like, symbolism alongside Christianity, reading about the People's Church and the Church Offensive, I was thinking a lot about how the first breakfast program that the Black Panther Party operated was out of the basement of Father Boyle's Sacred Heart Parish in San Francisco. A pretty monumental example, I think, and something that resonates with the Young Lords practice. Father Boyle let the Panthers use the space voluntarily, but do you think that there's something tactically useful about occupying a church as a kind of symbolic gesture? I mean, like, that kind of gets to the heart of, like, why occupy a church in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is symbolically important when you consider the kind of optics of what they're doing and how that plays out in media and in the local community, right? I mean, here they are, they're like, all we want to do is feed poor kids, right? And this church doesn't even have enough heart to let us feed poor kids. What does that say about the structures of an institution like this? What does that say about the various kind of mechanisms for colonizing our community? And that's something that kind of makes sense on both a kind of cognitive level and a really affective level, right? Like, no one likes to see, I mean, not to turn attention to what's happening today, but no one likes to see kids in distress, right? Because, like, kids shouldn't be in distress. Kids are, like, they're innocent creatures who just want to, like, play and love, and so when they're trying to, like, help support that to happen in the community, I think the church realized they were putting themselves in a bit of a bad position, which is why ultimately, while over 100 people were arrested for the occupation of the church, they weren't charged. The charges were dropped. Yeah. But the Young Lords were particularly media savvy, and other scholars have written about this too. One whose name is escaping me right now did really kind of, like, dove into the numbers of, like, how many articles were published in the New York Times about Puerto Ricans before the Young Lords and then during and after the Young Lords, and found that the Young Lords really contributed to an increase in news coverage about Puerto Ricans and about the issues facing the Puerto Rican community, and they really knew it. Like, they were conscious about how they looked on TV, and made sure to kind of, like, do things in a way that would be that would garner kind of additional support, and help them achieve the goals that they wanted to achieve.
That's so fascinating. I like thinking of this sort of revolutionary movement as having, like, a real sort of produced aesthetic. I mean, you saw that with the Panthers too, right? With the kind of like a uniform almost, showing up in leather jackets and sunglasses and just sort of looking like cool. That's, like, a lot of Black Panthers talk about that as being a conscious decision. Like, you want a group that feels kind of attractive one way or another, and to be able to have that kind of media savvy and understand what it takes, not just to be, like, aesthetically interesting, but to use that in a way that creates a real political change or a real change in media narratives is pretty impressive. Yeah, I feel like that actually speaks to the strength of your book. We've already mentioned, but the fact that it's not just a straightforward history or theory, but it's kind of somewhere between. Like, you track all these different ways that there's a lot of rhetoric being employed. And I kind of wonder, like, this lets you do a lot of cool analyses of decolonization and the people specifically, like the people as a kind of signifier that emerges out of all these tactics. So talk to us a little bit about maybe how the people emerges with the church offensive. Like, they call it a people's church. What does it mean to declare, like, a people's church in a decolonial movement, being interviewed by the press and showing up in TV and things like that?
Sure. I mean, I think a big part of it is this notion of the people, right, isn't a Young Lord's invention. It's not a 1960s radicals invention. It's a very kind of modern political concept that's intimately tied to kind of liberal democratic theory. And as a slogan, right, as a kind of political slogan, or what I call in the book an ideograph, it has a lot of power, right, within a political culture that is structured by liberal democratic ideals. The people occupy a kind of central location. Now, that central location is oftentimes fairly exclusive, right? So in the sense that it often excludes people of color, other marginalized and colonized communities. And so, it's a term that doesn't, in and of itself, doesn't have a lot of decolonial potential. But I think that's why it's important that the Young Lords latched onto that term and tried to kind of re-accent it through their activism at the church. And they did that in a lot of different ways by kind of creating less attention on kind of the ideals of individualism and focusing more on aspects of collectivism, for example, by visualizing the people in ways that were different than how the people had typically been visualized in, say, photojournalism. And I think doing that's important because it allows them to kind of, decolonial theorists like Walter Mignola will talk about the importance of changing the terms, right? And that is important. I don't want to discount that at all. But I think it's also important to be able to kind of refill those terms, right, that already exist with a different sort of meaning, right? To be able to break them down and not just get rid of them and start using different terms all the time. Because, other folks who might not be part of their community can identify with the people, right? In fact, as an ideograph, it's something that you can't really be against, right? And so by changing how that term is filled with meaning, they're able to kind of operate within the terms of kind of dominant political institutions while really kind of altering its valence through this different, what I call a decolonial accent.
Yeah, I was so interested in that bit, sort of midway through the chapter where you start talking about this, like the ideograph of the people. There's even a time when you use the phrase ideologizing ideology, sort of like you're stacking a term that is already sort of a reference to something, and delinking it, changing it, kind of setting course in a different direction. Could you comment on that just a little bit, the ideologizing ideology bit? I think that's an important idea.
Sure. Yeah, I mean that's an idea that's advanced by Chela Sandoval in her book, The Methodology of the Oppressed, which is a fantastic book that I really recommend reading. The idea there is I think you already described it fairly well, right? It's this idea that that rather than just finding a different terminology or finding a completely different ideology to supplant that which is already dominant, it's about kind of creating the space, finding those gaps, those fissures where meaning hasn't been closed off, and being able to kind of break it apart a bit and start turning it in on itself and using it against itself sometimes even. So it's something like the people. It's about part of what it's about is kind of pointing to the unfulfilled promise of the people, and trying to kind of finding ways to make good on that, right? So in other words, pointing out the ways in which it doesn't include third world people, and trying to make those people who have been excluded a central part of what that term can mean.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like, it's sort of a challenge of, do you not want a people's church? What's wrong with you? Why wouldn't you want the people's church? I think that's a really neat kind of rhetorical strategy.
It's still known as the people's church, by the way.
Oh, really? That's amazing.
Yeah, like people in the community still call it that. I think there might even be like a placard on the side of it. I'm trying to remember. But yeah.
That's really cool. Here in Canada, there's a tradition of the People's Church as well. Started in the right before the 20s and into the 30s. People's churches, they were labor churches, but same kind of thing, same kind of rhetorical move, I guess. Well, we're getting up to the end of the hour, but before we do kind of sign off, maybe we could ask you a sort of semi-personal but interesting question, and then close out on a question we always try to close out on. So, in the introduction to your book, you write, this is a little bit of a long quote, but I think it's worth reading. So you say, my goal is to offer one partial, perspectival, and contingent critical interpretive engagement of the Young Lords that grapples with the geographic and body political situatedness of their discourse and activism, as well as my own position as a diasporic Puerto Rican academic who is thinking and writing from within the global South rather than dominant Euro-American-centric modalities. So you say later on that doing this project sort of drew you into like really intimate connections with former Young Lords, like you describe, being in their houses and talking with them. But you also remained an outsider in the actual neighborhood. And a lot of really interesting stories in your introduction kind of draw that out. But after doing this project, how do you now relate to that identity that you articulate at the end of that quote? What's it like to be a Puerto Rican academic informed by the Young Lords in light of, say, like the Trump administration or, Hurricane Maria? It's like Puerto Rico is sort of a news item now, but it's not it's sort of frustratingly politicized in certain ways, it seems. So, yeah, I mean, do you have anything to kind of add to that in this particular context?
Yeah, I mean, I think that... to me, like the connection between the ideas and the kind of positionality that I'm trying to grapple with in the book, and the kind of Trump administration's reaction to Hurricane Maria, or to kind of refugees and asylum seekers on the border right now. I think the connection between those is that in both cases we're dealing with the kind of persistence of coloniality in the contemporary era, right? It's coloniality that enables the kinds of exclusive Eurocentric, American-centric theoretical perspectives that have cachet within academic circles, and it's coloniality that undergirds kind of understanding of the border that's kind of like tied to this fiction of sovereignty that kind of authorizes Trump and other presidential administrations to militarize this space and try to create kind of clear markers between us and them, in that place. So I think that, to me, thinking about like what's happening on the border, or what's happening with the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, where we're still, we're not even dealing with the kind of aftermath of colonialism because Puerto Rico is still a colony. Most recently with Promesa, you've got a board of people who are able to make decisions about like closing down schools and privatizing different sectors of the economy in ways that are not really in the best interest of the Puerto Rican people, but are in the best interest of the shareholders who are trying to like make good on the debts that are owed to them, right? And so rather than turning to like alternative energy sources, for example, as a colleague of mine, Catalina de Onís, would say, they're just trying to kind of like put a Band-Aid on a fundamentally kind of broken energy infrastructure that's not good for the planet and not good for the island, and is rooted in kind of logics of exploitation and possession, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but I started to think about the connections between these things, right, when I'm confronted with them. But
no, I think that's kind of what I'm curious to hear about. Is exactly like how do these things that appear as stories in the news, or they might appear as part of like like a monologue on a late night TV show, or they're kind of they're talking points. But they are part of real material histories that have like real material effects. You know, like when Stephen Colbert or Samantha Bee stops talking about Puerto Rico, it will still be a colony. It will still be sort of affected by these actual decisions. So yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to hear about.
Well, yeah, and then actually, I'm glad you mentioned history, because I wanted to make the point that, in a place like Puerto Rico, that history of colonialism, right, is what the present crisis is about, right? This, Hurricane Maria was not just this one event of a kind of natural disaster hurting the island. This is a structure of domination that goes back hundreds of years, right, that has put Puerto Rico in the place that it is now, which was, its energy infrastructure was teetering on the brink of collapse when the hurricane came through. It was just pushing over a domino that made everything fall down. Same thing's happening on the border right now. This isn't about just these individual people who are trying to seek refuge here in the United States. That doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's the same U.S. colonial policies that created these problems in Puerto Rico, that created problems throughout Central America and South America, that create the push pressures that make people come north, right? But kind of there seems to be a lack of awareness about that stuff, right? In a lot of the mainstream media discussions about either of these issues, and a lack of awareness about the kind of the racial and colonial structures of the laws that govern things like asylum and immigration, right? That someone like Sessions points to.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful note. Just like the media narrative paints it in a really particular and kind of hollow way that doesn't get at what's happening. Well, lastly, we have sort of a stock question we try to ask everyone who comes on the podcast. So here it is. What do you think Christians should know about Young Lords as a historical movement? And what do you think people who are invested in leftist movements and histories should know about Christianity?
I think in terms of what Christians should know about the Young Lords, I think to me, what they should know is kind of encapsulated in a lot of ways by that Juan Gonzalez clip from earlier. Right? The Young Lords held commitments to social justice ideals that come from that at least can be identified in Scripture in very clear ways. And so thinking about the Young Lords offers us an opportunity to examine modes of activism and the potentials for activism within local communities that otherwise you might not readily think about. In terms of what people who are invested in leftist movements and histories should know about Christianity, I think for me it would be that it would kind of relate to that notion of overlap that I was just talking about and that we talked about a little bit earlier. That I think there is strength in occupying the position of a yes rather than the position of a no. And what I mean by that is, even if you are, ideologically opposed to the idea of religion, even if you are, the most diehard atheist, sometimes approaching your message from that position is not the best way to invite people in and to create strength within the kind of organizing that you're trying to do. And I think that's something that the Young Lords intimately understood, this idea that we can't just come in and criticize Christianity 100%, right? We have to find those points of connection that can create opportunities for collaboration, as contingent as they might be, to be able to move forward and do good.
Oh, that's a great note. That's definitely what we're always trying to, I think, explore on this podcast is like, how can you find ways to say yes to these kinds of histories that don't like ignore their complexities, but maybe point like a different way forward. So, yeah. Well, thanks so much, Darrel, for this book and for talking to us about it. I feel like we really learned a lot, and I'm still like, I keep rereading sections of your book, trying to work out how to, I guess, keep thinking with the young lords about what it might mean to have a people's church. I would suspect if I went to my parish this Sunday, they probably wouldn't listen to me either if I got up and spoke at the end. But maybe someday.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me on and for this great conversation about the young lords. I mean, I'm so happy to do it, and thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you liked what you heard, definitely go out and check out Darrel's book. It's really, really great. We can't say enough good things about it. There's just a lot of good stuff. History, theory, something for everybody. Also, if you like what you heard, you can find more of us, the Magnificast, on Twitter at the Magnificast, on Facebook also the Magnificast, and we have a discussion group there, the Magnificast Basement, so you can chat a little bit more about these and other topics. Also, some podcast news. We set up a shop online. You can order some stickers that we made. That's the big news. Got some cool stickers, and you can also get shirts through them as well. But it's redbubble.com/people/the Magnificast. So check that out. And also another piece of news for people who are signed up on our Patreon, which is at patreon.com/the Magnificast. And who are giving $2 and up, we're going to send you a really cool pin, an enamel pin based on the communist crucifix that is also a sticker on the Redbubble site. So it's going to take some time to actually like get them made and have them sent to us and then send them out to everyone else. But if you want one, it's going to cost you at least $2 by July 1st. So go ahead and sign up on Patreon, and hopefully you'll stick around. Really thankful for everybody who supports the show so consistently. So this is just one way of saying thanks. As always, the music for the podcast comes from Amoria Armstrong, and the outro is from the Illogical Spoon. See you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no